His team are here in front of us tonight. We took tonight as the work session to work on traffic, and is dedicated to the traffic side of the applicant's indication for this development. So does the applicant have a presentation they want to present on traffic?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. Mark Bobrowski, attorney for the applicant. Yes, we do. Rob Nagy sitting behind me, and he's got something teed up behind you.
Okay, great. Thank you. As he gets prepared, I want to announce that Matthew Doyen is here tonight with CEI, one of the town's consultants. In addition to that, also the BSC group. Samuel is also here with us tonight. Regretfully, we did not get documents in time. They came in this afternoon. We're going to have to work on providing documents to us a lot quicker than when we're receiving them. Getting documents this afternoon by email for a traffic event tonight to discuss is not acceptable, and I think it's apparent. I don't know why we didn't get them until today, but I think between VHB and our consultants, our timing aspects should be further in advance than they currently are, because I just don't think it's acceptable that we get these reports this afternoon for a meeting on this sensitive subject tonight. Okay, with that, why don't we go through the presentation?
All right, for the record, my name is Robert Nagy. I'm with Vanasang and Breslin. I do have a PowerPoint presentation behind you here, so I don't mind speaking to your backs while you're watching that, as long as you can hear me. I'm involved in the project. Last time we had a presentation here, Sean Manning from our office filled in for me as I was unable to attend the hearing. But I want to make sure that this document and this presentation sort of touches on a lot of the issues that were brought up in that meeting, and retouches on several of the traffic issues that we want to make sure is clear to everybody. So in my presentation. Okay, thank you. Okay, can people behind me hear me? All right, in my recap of my presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go quickly through the traffic study that we did. I know some of this stuff is going to be repetitive to what was presented at the last hearing, but I want to make sure I touch on a few issues. I certainly want to go over our responses to some of the questions that were raised, comments that were raised as part of the BSC's review of that traffic study. I know Sam is here from BSC. I can certainly talk a little bit about some of his questions, and I do apologize for the timing of the responses. I do have copies, paper copies of our responses with all the attachments here if the board needs them, if they haven't received them yet, but I just want to make sure that those are available to the board. And I know Sam received a copy of them as well this afternoon. And then talk a little bit about some of our next steps as it relates to where we're going with traffic. So as we talked about the last meeting, the study area is divided into 4 specific locations, starting down at Fortune Boulevard and working our way up and touching on 3 sort of residential intersections that intersect with Route 16. As part of that, we did traffic data collection out there. We gathered the information as to how much traffic is going through those intersections. What you see on the screen here is a screenshot from the actual traffic study, looking at the evening peak hour traffic volumes. We also studied the morning peak hour traffic volumes. Route 16 carries about 13, almost 14,000 cars a day on it. It's a busy street. Its jurisdiction is owned by the Mass Department of Transportation, and is certainly something that they're going to spend some time looking at once we get to the design review part of this project. During the morning rush hour, there's about 1,100 cars, if you will, on Route 16. Most of those are heading eastbound towards, say, Hopkinton, the Holliston area. And in the evening, there's about 1,200 cars an hour traveling up and down that road, which makes it a pretty busy street, with about 60% of those cars actually traveling towards 495 in the Fortune Boulevard area. As part of our project, what we typically do is we look at background projects. Are there any specific developments that are happening in the area that may impact traffic operations in addition to the project-specific traffic impacts that we're talking about? As part of our research and dealing with town staff, as well as Mass DOT. We identified four specific projects out there. Again, none of them are major development projects that would generate a lot of traffic and additive traffic to the roadway system. But they are traffic impactors in and of themselves. The four projects that we identified are up there. It's a concrete batch plant that's currently being constructed off of East Main Street. There's a redevelopment of the Kmart Plaza that I'm sure all of you are aware of. There's a gas station being proposed at Route 85 close to Cedar Street, and then a restaurant depot, which is something that sort of caters to some of the restaurant industry. All of those four projects were included as we start to look into the future of what the traffic conditions out there on Route 16 are going to be. In addition to that, we also spend some time looking at just general housing starts and other things. So what we typically do is we add about 1% per year of development growth onto all the traffic projections that we have. We work with MAPC and the Central Mass Regional Planning Agency a lot, and what we do is we try to identify how many new homes, for example, are being started in different areas. Usually there's small subdivisions, 1 or 2 homes, 3 or 4, that sometimes work in their way. And what we've noticed is there's been about a little less than a percent per year in housing start growth in this area that would be additive to the traffic volume. So what we did was we marked the volumes up in looking at that way. We also noted that there's a planned roadway project, a construction project that's starting to get through the system at the intersection of Route 16 between 109 and Beaver Street. That's something that's at the 25% design stage. Doesn't necessarily mean that the project is imminent, but it does include the intersection of Fortune Boulevard and Beaver Street, which was something that a resident or a member of the audience asked me about earlier. It does look at improving some of the operational safety issues at that specific intersection. Traffic generation, I know we spent a little bit of time talking about it last week, and I know our last hearing, and I just want to reiterate, go over it one more time. What we typically do for projects like this is we look at the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual. The ITE, for shorthand, Trip Generation Manual, is a compilation of a number of studies that happened at similar projects ranging in size from 5 apartment complexes all the way up to the thousands of units. And what they do is they go through this effort and they try to compile the number of trips that would be generated by a project like this and try to come up with an average rate of how much traffic would be generated in this situation. Oh, okay. Thanks. So for a project like this where you're talking about 300 residential units, that's a very comparable and normal size of an apartment development. It's moderate in size, certainly not something that you would find in the city, but for a suburban area like Milford and some of the Metro West communities, it's a pretty sizable project when you look at it. And what we do is we look at the number of trips that come to it on a daily basis. We also look at it from an hourly basis because that's where the most impact is typically felt, in the morning commuter rush hour and in the evening commuter rush hour. Typically, when you think about a project or when you think about traffic impacts, they're most busy, intersections are most congested during the morning and evening rush hours, and certainly sometimes on Saturday, depending on special events and the such. So what you see up there is our trip generation totals, meaning the morning peak hour is for about 300 units is going to generate, during that 1 hour, that 60-minute period, about 150 vehicle trips, some of those coming in, but the majority of them leaving in the morning. And flipping it around in the evening, there's about 185 trips that would be coming into the site, with, again, the majority of them, 120 of them coming in the morning, coming into the site, and about 60 of them going out of the project site. That doesn't mean that outside of that 60-minute period, there's not traffic generation. There's certainly going to be traffic generation during the half hour and the half before and after that one peak period. But for a project that's like this, during those peak hours, that's typically what you would see for a project like this. And I think, as you see on the column on the right there, an as of right office development that could be considered out here would generate a significantly more, significant amount of volume on this street. And obviously, something like that would require its own traffic mitigation. I won't get into the details of that because that's really not what we're talking about with this project. Where's the traffic coming from? Where's it going to? As part of our efforts, what we do is we look at the journey to work data that's provided to us by the U.S. Census Department. Where are people in Milford working in a residential project like this? What we typically do is we analyze that, we see where people are coming from and going to, and we send those people out onto the roadways. We couple that with looking at how people are exiting and entering the residential streets that also surround Route 16. Are the bulk of the people who are leaving leaving their houses that exist today, are they taking a right or are they taking a left and leaving their driveways onto Route 16? And what we found, generally speaking, is that for the most part, there's a small percentage of people who are going east, meaning towards Hopkinton and Holliston, where the majority of the people would continue west. About 40% of the people would continue west past Fortune Boulevard. Some amount of people would travel north on Fortune Boulevard, probably to get to 495 and head north towards the Mass Pike and other locations, and then a smaller percentage would travel down Beaver Street. 10% of the traffic is what we assign there to head into that direction. What does this translate to as far as impacts to the roadways? So I mentioned before that we did our traffic counts out there and we grew them. What you see up here, the column on the left, the no-build condition is how much traffic would typically, what we'd expect to see on those roadways during the peak commuter hours without the project being built. And then the build column shows how much traffic would be on those roadways if this project was built. And then the column on the right, which I'll correct the projector here so people can see it. You can see what the sort of the incremental difference is out there. And in most of those cases, if you talk about Beaver Street, for example, you'd likely see a 15-car increase along that roadway. That's new car every 4 minutes or so during that peak hour. On Fortune Boulevard, north of Route 16, heading past some of the retail developments up there, you'd probably see anywhere between 45 and 55 new cars on that roadway as compared to the 1,100 or the almost 900 cars an hour that currently or would be expected to drive on those roadways. Again, Route 16 west of Beaver Street, about a car a minute, 60 cars an hour, 75 cars an hour during the evening rush hour. And then Route 16 east of Adams Street up there, you can see it's about a 30 or 40 car increase on those roadways. And I think that the point that this map is, or this graphic is trying to say is, listen, there's impacts to these roadways. Nobody's trying to shy away from those, but the volumes that are already out there will show that they're relatively within the range of traffic that might happen any day to day out there. So on Monday, you might see 1,100 cars out there on Route 16 in the morning. On Tuesday, you might see 1,200. Traffic engineering is not an exact science, I admit that fully. But what we do is we try to take these averages and try to force them, or try to feed into them. So what you'd see is that 30-car swing that this project may or may not create on those roadways is, you know, within that swing of daily or hourly fluctuations that may happen between Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So it would be hard to notice the incremental changes that might happen out there on those roads. As traffic engineers, what does this mean? Engineering isn't just guesswork, there is modeling that goes into this. And what we try to do is we try to look at how the impacts of the project are going to affect the roadways. And we do that by doing a number of different studies. The first is it's a model, it's a computer-generated model that takes into consideration driver habits, the design, the geometric design of a roadway, how many lanes are provided, if it's a signalized intersection, what's the allocation of green time to each of the approaches. And what we do is we come up with a model that shares with us how much delay is experienced at each of those intersections. And then we add our traffic on top of that to see what the incremental change in that increase is going to be. Typically, what we want to see is during rush hour periods, it's graded, each intersection is then graded on a level of service table, which is A through F, not unlike a report card, where A is perfect free flow condition, nobody's waiting they're maybe waiting 5 seconds or so at an intersection, and then they're moving right through it, all the way down to F, which is people are waiting more than 75 seconds at a particular location to get through it. And I think that is just in general something that we want to avoid in any situation. Typically, as traffic engineers, what we try to do is we try to accommodate during rush hour periods a level of service D. I know that you wouldn't be happy with your kid if you came home with a D in his report card, but at the same point in time, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that traffic is flowing through the intersection at a reasonable pace with about anywhere from 30 to 40 seconds of delay, which is what most people typically are willing to experience at a traffic signal on any sort of flow. You get through in one traffic cycle. You come up to the signal. If you have to stop just as the light turns red, you're willing to wait through that one process and then get through. What people are not willing to do typically is wait more than one traffic cycle, 2 or 3 traffic cycles. Then we know the signal is broken. It's not doing what its job is intended to do. And what we do is we try to then apply mitigation to those locations. So in this case here, all the intersections that we studied, the 4 that I went over in the very beginning here, they're all operating at level of service D or better. The site driveway is one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, where we need to implement some mitigation, obviously, for the project. The one signalized intersection in this study it's working as well at level of service D with the recommendations that are in place and how it's operating today. In order to sort of buttress that, we wanted to make sure that models are one thing, but real world conditions are a second consideration. So what we did was we went out into the field and we sat at the end of Whispering Pine Drive and tried to watch how traffic was flowing back and forth along Route 16. And in doing that, we tried to see how many gaps are in the traffic stream itself, and we timed them. Typically, a driver wants to accept a gap that's greater than 6 seconds between cars so that they can pull out into a street and then move. And what we did was we wanted to make sure that this particular corridor, while we understand is busy, it is sometimes metered by the Fortune Boulevard traffic signal that's downstream, so cars come through in sort of a platooned factor. We wanted to make sure that there were enough gaps in the traffic stream to accept the volume of traffic that exists out there today, but also would be able to accept the traffic volume that's coming out of this project's driveway. And what we found was there are approximately 300 or so gaps that happen during the busy peak hour out there that would be allowing some of the cars to come in and out of the traffic stream. And as I mentioned earlier, when you looked at how much traffic might be generated by this project, there's about 100 cars, 150 cars plus or minus that would be coming in and out of the project site. So there's more than enough gaps to handle the volume of traffic that wants to leave the project site in the existing traffic stream out there today. Safety is probably the number 1 thing that traffic engineers spend their most time focusing on. Level of impact, level of service, being delayed at an intersection is important in the consideration of what a project is, but if it's designed in an unsafe manner, obviously, that doesn't work for anybody. So what we did was we spent some time looking at some of the safety implications of locating the driveway along Route 16. The location that's opposite Whispering Pine Drive provides good sight lines in each direction out there, and what it does is it meets what we consider the typical design standards for a corridor out there. Now, I know BSC commented on that extensively, on making sure that that driveway is met. The sight lines are met for cars that want to both pull out onto Route 16, as well as cars that are driving along Route 16 and maybe come across a car that's pulling out into the street. We'll go over some of the responses to the comments in a moment here, but I want to assure the board that the driveway is going to be designed in a way that's safe and it meets all the typical industry design standards for sight lines, both for cars pulling out as well as cars that are driving along Route 16. And then project vehicle, ultimately what are the project impacts? The traffic study that we submitted shows that at unsignalized intersections, there's not going to be expected to be much more than 2 cars queuing at any location, particularly in the site driveway situation, given what we did with the gap study that I talked about. There'll be adequate gaps for people to get out. There may be 2 or 3 cars in certain extreme circumstances, but it looks like from our modeling that there'll be 2 vehicles or less on average stopped at the various different, at the site driveway pulling out onto Route 16. And then what are the delays for the motorists? Exclusive of this project, people who live on Zane and Whispering Pine and some of the other streets out there, what you'd see is typically with the additive increase of this project, you'd probably see an additional 2 or 3 seconds of delay for those folks who are trying to pull out onto the street, because we're now, for lack of a better term, using up some of those gaps along the traffic stream that I talked about earlier by adding more cars to the system. What are some of the recommendations that we considered out here? I know there was a little bit of talk about a traffic signal being installed out here. One of the things that we did, the first thing that we typically do is we look at what's required for a traffic signal. Federal Highway Administration and MassDOT both say that a certain volume of traffic has to be sort of present at an intersection for you even to consider the placement of a traffic signal at it. And in this particular case, given the volume of traffic that we're generating with this project, and there's certainly not a lot of traffic coming out of Whispering Pines, it doesn't meet the warrants that are required to consider it. So as traffic engineers, we cannot consider placing a traffic signal at that location. If this was a larger project, certainly we might be able to do that, but given the numbers that we have here today, they're not. What we did make a recommendation to do, however, is put a left turn lane onto Route 16 into the project site. I don't know if that was talked about at the last meeting, but one of the commitments that we have is we're going to be putting in a left turn lane into the project site out there, so that traffic that wants to pull off of the main line is not delaying and impeding traffic that's traveling back and forth along 16. You can continue to go by. What that will entail is a widening of the corridor. We're going to have to work with MassDOT because, again, it's their roadway, and if needed, we may need to move a couple of utility poles and widen the roadway probably anywhere from 4 to 7 feet in width in the area of that project driveway. We also want to make sure that there's an ability to turn into the driveway, so we recommended that there be a flared right turn movement off of Route 16 into the project driveway there so that traffic doesn't come to a complete stop and then turn right into it, that it's able to sort of make its way into the driveway without slowing down to that 0 mile per hour part where now you're delaying, again, people behind you who want to continue down the roadway. I talked a little bit before about improving sight lines through vegetation clearing out there. That's absolutely a recommendation of ours. The final site plans that come before this board will include site triangles that will need to be cleared and will also need to be put into perpetuity to sort of make sure that no signage, no vegetation, nothing is put into that area there that would impede those sight lines. We want to make sure that that works, and again, I'll talk a little bit about that in the response to comments section later. The driveway itself needs to be constructed with separate right and left turn lanes coming out of it. The left turn lane, for anybody, the small amount of people who may want to shoot across into Whispering Pines, if they have friends or relatives that they want to visit over there, the left turn lane would also serve as that through lane. We want anybody who wants to turn right to be able to turn right out of the driveway and not be stuck behind the occasional couple of cars that might be waiting to turn left onto 16. And then we also want to work with MassDOT and the Metro West Regional Transit Authority to identify where and how best to put a bus stop out on Route 16 in this location here. That would also serve to some degree as a potential bus stop for the children who may or may not be, who would be working through this site. And that's something that we'll need to work through with the town from a site design perspective there. Last but not least, sidewalks is imperative. It's a residential project. We want to make sure that there's adequate sidewalks both provided on the site and how that connects out onto the local street system. We want to make sure that that connects. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of sidewalk area out there, and frankly, there are no sidewalks on 16 today, but where we can provide them and where we think that people will be, we want to be able to provide those sidewalks. If there's a bus stop located on the opposite side of Route 16, we'd want to make sure that there was a crosswalk there, and I know that the town's consultant mentioned that as part of his review as well. I can get into the responses to the BSC comments right now if you'd like. I don't know if it may be worthwhile to hear from BSC directly, or I can just sort of put them in my own words. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so in BSC's letter, and again, they're here if you have any questions about the intent or questions, but how we interpreted the responses. What they did was they looked at a number of issues. I think they ultimately ended up with about 23 or 24 specific comments on the project. Some of them were more confirmatory comments saying, hey, listen, the traffic data gathering that we went through, the trip generation, how we distributed the traffic is all based on reasonable assumptions. They asked for some additional data just to reconfirm that data, which is included in the package that we sent to them today, and that the project impacts that I went over specifically as far as delays are concerned and queues are concerned is done to industry standards and is something that this board could perhaps rely upon as part of their fact finding as part of the traffic impacts here. Where they asked for some additional information and they wanted us to mine down a little deeper was looking at some of the crash data that exists out there. Again, I talked a little bit about safety being an important component to this. If there are high crash locations out there, if, say, for example, Zane or Whispering Pines or some of the roads that exist out there today exhibit a high crash tendency, meaning that they see 5 or 6 accidents a year, adding traffic to that isn't going to help that situation. And in that situation, we want to make sure that we have a positive effect to this. So what we did was we provided additional data on the traffic data, crash information out there. And what we found is that there's no accident issues at any of the specific intersections that we looked at. There's average, maybe 1 or 2 accidents per year that are happening at some of these locations, which is typical for these kinds of roadways. If somebody just gets bumped from behind, gets tapped as they're turning into or rear-ended as they're coming into it, but that's something that's as painful as it is for me to say. That's typical for a roadway of this case. So there's no heightened concern about traffic safety that looks back into the past and says that, yeah, there's an issue there that we need to address. The site driveway design is something that we spent a little bit of time talking about in our letter. The BSC letter talked about, is it appropriately located? Should it be shifted to the left or the right, or north or east or west? Should it be median divided? Should it be a single lane? And our response is pretty clear. The location that we selected is good for a planning perspective. It's located opposite another residential street, so we're not adding another layer of friction into the roadway system. It's located across the street from an intersection that already exists today, so we're not going to have to relearn that there's a new intersection there. We're not going to have to create new opportunities for people to sort of consider, okay, there's Whispering Pine on my right, now I got to worry about this site driveway on my left as I drive through this area. It's located at one location. It'll be a lighted intersection so people can see, not signalized, but lighted so that people can see any cars that are in there, pedestrians perhaps. And if we can't offset it by a short amount of distance, we wouldn't want to put a new roadway that's, say, 50 or 100 feet away from existing intersection. What we'd want to do is we want to move it 200 feet. And as you look at the site plan and you look at the wetland configurations out there, if you shift the roadway, the internal site driveway 200 feet to the east, it has a significant impact on wetland resources that exist out there. If you shift it to the west, we're limited by the property that we own in that direction, and there's really not an opportunity to sort of create that safe intersection that we want. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we had found is that location right there opposite Whispering Pines is the ideal location, the safest location for putting it in. As far as median division versus not median division, one of the things that we spend some time working with, and I have our site engineer Dan Feeney here as well, is looking at what that added impact is to the wetland resources. I don't mean to say that wetland resources govern everything, but at the same point in time, we're held to a certain standard by your Conservation Commission and by the environmental folks that we have to minimize to the greatest degree possible what that impact would be to those resources. So what we're talking about here is actually creating a single lane, not a single lane, but a single roadway, not median divided. I think that might have been, conceptually discussed at the last meeting. This would be one lane, with adequate width for emergency vehicles. I know that they've talked to the fire chief, and he's looked at it and said that it's reasonable from his perspective, from a fire response perspective. And again, I won't speak for him, but I suspect he'll have some commentary either on this tonight or at some future point. But that right there was something that we felt was probably the most important piece of this, is making sure that he was comfortable with the access. And what we did was we ended up going with that widened single roadway without the median in the middle of it. What are the sight lines? Are they provided at the driveway, or are they adequate? There was an issue. There's a sight line. In order to make this driveway work, there's a sight line that goes over an adjacent property owner's property. I do know that our client has worked with that applicant. Whoop, got it, good catch. Has worked with that neighbor, and that what this project requires is that sight line to be over that person's property. So what will happen is that they'll grant an easement for sight lines only. It's not going to affect the value of their house. It just means that that area that I talked about that needs to be cleared will be part of our sightline triangles that I talked about a little while ago. And the important part there is that will just make sure that there's no specific structures built on that piece of property, and that there's no vegetation or anything that would be put into that piece of property that would obstruct vision in that direction. Other than that, there was some commentary about the speeds of traffic along Route 16. We had done speed observations out there. Traffic travels at about 41 to 38 miles an hour, depending on which direction you travel. The traffic consultant from VSC asked us to look at the actual posted speed limit, which is 40, a little bit higher than the 38 that we saw out there. And what we did was we raised the evaluation to that 40 mile an hour request that he had asked us to do. So it asks us to actually look a little further, provide that sight line that's a little further out there on 16 itself. The plans themselves did not reference and show a left turn lane coming into the project site. That is something that is going to be part of this project. I've told our client that, the applicant that, and that is something that will need to be worked into the design plans as we go through this process. It's important to remember that while I would love to say, here's the plan and it's locked in stone, it's Mass DOT's roadway. So what we need to do in concert with the town is go back to MassDOT once this project is conceptually approved and make sure that they're comfortable with the layout and the design of what that's going to be. We may show 11-foot lanes with 11-foot left turn lane with 14-foot, exterior lanes out there with sidewalks in certain areas. DOT may come back to us and say, we want a little wider, you can get away with a little narrower, we want sidewalks on one side, we want them on both sides. So that's something that is going to be part of this process, and I would suspect in typical projects like this, where we have DOT jurisdictional issues, we ask that this board condition the project on getting Mass DOT final approval for the driveway design. For the driveway design. Last, but conceptually, what we've told you is there'll be a left turn lane out there that meets their standards, and ultimately they'll approve as part of this process. And then lastly, there were various comments on the site plan. Where are some of the sidewalks going to be located? Is there accessible routes between certain handicap parking spaces in the building itself? And are there, where are the limits of some of the elements here? And are there design elements that are going to go into it? I'll let Dan address some of those issues as we go through the process, as he goes through the process in the site design piece. But I do want to assure the board that if there are any handicap accessibility issues, if there's any ADA issues, we have to meet those design standards, and that they'll ultimately be worked into the final set of plans here. I think that's it. That's a lot. I realize that. Our next steps is to sort of work with BSC and the board and the town staff to come up with what that conceptual design of the left turn lane is going to be with MassDOT. Show on the plans what the limit of those sightline easements are going to be, work with the Metro West Regional Transit Authority to come up with the best locations for the bus stops along 16, or if they even want to put them there. We'll talk a little bit about pedestrian and parking layout accessibility, and then again, commit to working with the town. In fact, when we do end up meeting with MassDOT, I would request, and I'll commit to having an invite come out to the town staff to be part of that discussion as we go through that, so they can reflect the town's questions, comments, and concerns.
Okay, great. Thank you. A couple of the comments that I just want to make early on, and I need some clarification. Concerning Route 16, you indicated approximately 14,000 cars a day. Approximately 11,000 of those cars go eastbound. However, your table indicated something different.
Hold on, no, so there's
60% tend to go to 490. So
okay.
it was a confusing of how you actually presented it, because you indicated Route 16 has 14,000 cars a day. However, 11,000 of those you indicated went eastbound.
If that's what I said, I didn't mean that. So if there's 13,000 cars a day out on the corridor, they're broken up 60-40 typically. So it's not 13,000 and 11,000. It's 13,000 and more likely 7,000 cars going eastbound, 5,000 cars going westbound.
Because that's why I'm saying,
Yeah.
when you announced that, and then we went into the tables, you were contradicting yourself. A couple of comments, and I want to reach out to the BSC people in CEI. Concerning the traffic study that was done and the dates they were done, and then we're seeing tables 4 and 5 showing traffic that heads up north on Fortune Boulevard. And then we have the batching plant with heavy trucks, and we have Milford Stone with heavy trucks. And all those traffics actually end up backing traffic up when these trucks enter Route 16. So my question is, was there traffic studies done post Stop and Shop, because you're doing an awful lot of indications down on Beaver Street, Fortune Boulevard, 109, 16 in that area. I don't see any traffic reports that were done with the new development that just went in, the additional 50,000 square feet of buildings on top of what the old center was that is going to be occupied, and that traffic, most of that traffic dumps out onto Beaver Street. Saying that, we know that the aspects of the old Stop and Shop location is now vacant, so there's no traffic really coming out of there, in the addition to the additional buildings that will need to be built out on Fortune Boulevard. So I know that you've done your traffic studies on Route 16, close to the subject site. My question is there any planned additional traffic reports taken into consideration, the much more added traffic that's coming down Route 16 from all this new development that was done?
So the only traffic that we added into the background assessments were the 4 projects that we knew about when we did our traffic study. That was the Kmart Plaza and the work that was going on down there, the retrofit of the old Bugaboo Creek Steakhouse and the project down there. We considered the concrete plant and the traffic impacts that were associated with that, the minor gas station and the restaurant depot that I mentioned before. If there are other development projects that are happening in the town beyond that, that would be major traffic generators, I can assure you that they were not considered in our traffic study. If there's any specific ones that the town has copies of, if somebody did a site plan approval process or went through the site plan approval process to modify something, we'd need to take a look at what those studies were. The traffic impacts associated with those projects, that said, should also be mitigated in their own right through the town's process as well. This project is important, obviously, for various different reasons, but another project that creates a significant amount of traffic needs to mitigate their own project impacts, not unlike this applicant.
And that's the question that I brought up when we did do the permitting aspect of a master plan on Route 85 off of Deer Street. That master plan showed over $6.5 million of off-site improvements as part of that master plan. So when you're taking into consideration a major project, you try to work with the city, the town, and the community to make it a win-win for everybody, not just saying, I don't want to do lights. I think that we should not have a boulevard into the subdivision. Frankly, I think there should be a boulevard into the subdivision. It should be separated. It may have some impact on some wetlands. I think that's a safety aspect, so it's a small price to pay. The wetlands can be replicated, but it really becomes a safety factor. It also ends up gapping the system. The fire apparatus can have gap systems within the boulevard into the site. So, you know, that's kind of a pet peeve right now concerning that situation. I mean, there are others, but I just want to bring those comments out since the traffic consultant is here and we're talking about the traffic aspects of not only Route 16, but also into the site. And I'm going to go back to my last comment that I understand your traffic generations and your assumptions. I just don't think 150 trips coming out of there means that there's only 150 people going to work every day out of a 300-unit apartment complex. It just doesn't seem reasonable. You're doing computer-generated assumptions, which is great because technology gives us that availability, but you know, real life and real traffic are a little bit different than what a computer generates. So those are comments I want to make. I'd like to send this off to Sam and Matt and kind of fill us in on his comments. And again, I think this board is frustrated getting this afternoon, and this type of information has to be far in advance in our hands versus, the afternoon. So whatever we need to do to correct that, that's the first thing I think we need to do. So Sam, if you've got some comments concerning some of these, would like to hear them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Rob has gone over most of the comments, but there are a few things that I think we need to clarify, and maybe he should have clarified with respect to the trip generation. The 150 trips that he's generating is just in the morning between 7 and 8 p.m. And before then, where I live, say in Bereka, people get onto Route 3 at 5 o'clock to head down. So people start leaving long before even the peak hour. So it's really not just that 7 to 8 time frame that people will be leaving the site. All the 300 people will not be leaving during that 1 hour. They'll be leaving spread over some time. So the impact is not only the peak hour, it's going to be over a longer period of time. But the peak period is when you're going to have the peak impact. So we tend to look at those times and see that if the roadway can handle the traffic at that time, then other times of the day, the traffic could be handled. So maybe that is the way I would explain the way the peak hour is looked at. With respect to the delays, just looking at the numbers that he had here, I think when this driveway, the proposed driveway is put across from Whispering Drive, I think the delays do go up more than the 2 to 3 seconds, at least based on his table here. I think in the morning, let me just be certain about the table number.
Yeah, give us the section number, please.
It would be table 8 in the traffic study, which is on page 20
Page 20.
of the traffic study, not the response to comments, but the traffic
Traffic
study.
Yeah,
study
in
itself.
the traffic study itself. So I think when you look at it, between the 2024 no build and the 2024 build conditions, in the morning, the traffic delay to vehicles exiting Whispering Drive will go from 25 seconds to 48 seconds. So there's an additional 23 seconds, delay associated with vehicles coming out of Whispering Drive. And in the evening, it's worse. It goes from 30 to 75 seconds. The only thing about the evening is that not too many people are actually leaving Whispering Drive, so the very few vehicles that are going out are going to experience longer delays. BSC had commented on the location of the driveway because there's this aspect too of if you have a four-way intersection, you have more conflict. When somebody's coming out of a site and wanting to make a left or a right, at a four-way intersection, you have more conflict than if it's a three-way intersection. So at a T intersection, you have what we call about 9 conflicts. At a four-way intersection, you have about 32 conflicts. So inherently, there is more of an issue at a four-way intersection than a three-way. So when we say that consider separating intersections, so that they will have three-way intersections, so if you just look at it from the number of conflict points, if they separate the intersections, it's going to be about 18 conflicts versus the 32 conflicts that a four-way would be providing. But then there are overriding issues, and I know Mass DOT also tend to want the driveways consolidated. So they would definitely be pushing for that four-way so that everything is at that one location. But it's something to, for you to think about because there are positives and negatives as to what you do with a four-way and a three-way. The other comment I have is about the side distance. And the reason why I think it's important to maybe move beyond the conceptual plans and show that left-hand lane is that once they provide that left-hand lane on East Main Street, it's going to push the stop line on the side driveway even further back. So we need to know where somebody coming out of the project is really going to stop. And then if they are stopped there, how are they going to see towards Wildwood or across that property? So you need to really lay it out. And when you are talking to that neighbor about the easement, you want to make sure that whatever easement is granted you really covers what you really need. Because if you get what you are showing today and that driveway is pushed, the stop line is pushed back, then it's going to be a problem in the future. So all those things need to be done. And I do agree that DOT is going to have the final say, but I think they also will listen to input from the town because it is your roadway, but it's your town. So you also, the safety issues are really going to be your concerns as well. I think at this point, I can take, if there are specific questions, I can respond to them.
Yeah,
but these were the main points I wanted to.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll turn it over to the board members. Once the board members have their comments, questions, then I'll turn it over to the audience because we don't want to, of course, duplicate a lot of the answers and the questions that have already maybe have been asked. And a quick comment, I know we're trying to push for lights. You're indicating that the state doesn't feel that we've hit that traffic curve concerning lights. And again, I think the Mass DOT would try to work favorably with the towns and the development group to try and make this as safety first type of project. Even if it's a blinking light or a double blinking light, it may be better than what's currently there. So I am not throwing lights off the table. I think it needs to be further gone through. I know the planning board wants it. I also know the planning board is also concerned with sight lines and line of sight. So, we just keep on grinding it out, and we'll continue to do this until, we can all come to a realization to work cooperatively together to make sure that this is done correctly and with future forethought as well as great discrimination. Charlie?
Okay, that was a lot of data. The first question I have is, what is the tripwire to get a successful warrant for any kind of signals at that intersection? Because we keep talking about the number of vehicles coming out, but what says to the state, Bing, that should have a sight? I should have a signal.
So there's a series of specific warrants that could be triggered. Some of them are based on volume, some of them are based on potential for pedestrian crossings, some of them are based on safety issues. The safety one is something that you really can't consider because you have to actually exhibit intersection crashes before it can be put into place. So we take that one off the table. The project isn't in a school zone or something like that, so there's not going to be a lot of pedestrian traffic that's going to be generated by this site, certainly vehicular, but not pedestrian. So we take that one off the table. And what we look at is we look at the four main traffic volume-based ones. The first one, the main one, is that you need to basically have 600 cars an hour for 8 straight hours, or I shouldn't say 8 straight hours, over the course of a 24-hour period. 600 cars on the main line traveling back and forth before the site, and then anywhere from 140 to 400 cars coming out the side streets. Now, I demonstrated to you earlier tonight from a trip generation perspective that during the busiest time of this site, we're only going to be seeing about 125 cars coming out of the driveway. So we're not going to hit the 8-hour traffic volume warrant, which is the gold standard for putting a traffic signal in there. Then what they do is they look at 4-hour increments, smaller numbers. In particular, they want to make sure that there's adequate volume out there, but those are typically higher numbers. They're higher traffic generators. So you might see an office park that everybody leaves the site at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and they arrive at 9 in the morning. Those types of project sites might get a traffic signal put out front, but in those situations, you're looking at 200 to 300 cars an hour needing to come out of the side street. And again, we've demonstrated that that's not going to be the case here. Then during the off-peak periods, the light goes to flash in those situations. So I would suggest to you that we're really not close to getting any of the traffic signal warrants met that the state and the Federal Highway Administration is going to look at and ask us to put in there. Me as a professional engineer, putting traffic signals into places that are not warranted create other unintended consequences because they're not expected at locations. Well, the residents of Milford who drive back and forth on the roadway would understand, hey, there's a traffic signal there, I need to stop. It's the people that don't or are unfamiliar with the roadways all of a sudden get this traffic signal that comes up upon them. They tend to go through it, they ignore it, and more importantly, not to suggest that anybody out here would do this, but if they're waiting at a traffic signal and there's no volume out there during the quiet times of the day, people tend to sort of turn and go into just drive through it. So we don't want to set up that kind of situation out here. So the numbers simply don't meet the thresholds for a traffic signal out here.
All right. So and you probably have to educate me, if in fact you don't meet the warrant analysis, does that mean at that point the state would not entertain it or they wouldn't pay for it?
They would not entertain it on their roadway.
So you're saying if you as a developer said, listen, we're trying to deal with this, and the town of Milford has become very strong about the issue that they want a light at that intersection, and we're willing to put up the funds to do that so that we can, do it for the town. Is that a possibility?
In my dealings with the state, nothing's an impossibility, a true impossibility, of course. But in my dealings with the state, it's a non-starter with them and on their roadways. Where I have seen it is in local communities. Communities have said, listen, we want to bypass those warrants. And what they'll do is they'll issue a letter of liability release to the design engineers, like myself, like Sam, and say, if anything happens out there, you're not going to be sued for the placement out there. Ultimately, we would be, because the town has limited liability. But so we wouldn't, we typically wouldn't handle something like that, even on a town's basis. But I have seen towns do that in the past.
Samuel, what do you think the chances are, given this situation, to have a signal at that location?
I think I have to agree with Rob on this. In fact, I've seen the state writing certain things saying that if the signals are not warranted, they wouldn't put them there. And the guiding document that is used for all these things actually make it clear that if you put in an unwarranted signal, because the signal is a legal thing. So if it's not warranted, it's illegal. And even if you have a signal in place and somebody does a study and sees that that is not a warranted signal, you are actually required to remove the signal from operation. But I think what can happen here is maybe, as the chairman said, maybe looking to get a flashing beacon, especially for the pedestrian crossing, because the whole point of a signal here is, or having something there is to alert people to the presence of the intersection. So somebody's coming, along 16 and he sees the light flashing, it's a caution to tell them to slow down. And I think that is what you'll be more successful at getting here. But to get a full stop and go with these volumes, I don't think the state will entertain it on their roadway.
Okay, because one of the things I noticed in traveling in certain towns, when you go by a school zone, there's a flashing light there, and it really flashes at certain hours of the day as to when you should be slowing down in that particular area. So what you're saying is to chase a signal by the state in that area will probably not be successful. What would be successful is to work with the developer to put some kind of a beacon there, to put some kind of lights there that would slow people down, knowing that there's a situation going on there.
Yeah, I think you still need a state approval because it's their roadway. But what you see at a school is a school zone, is a specific thing. What you get here is not associated with a school zone. It's
Right.
going to be safe for the crosswalk. So you can have it there as a flashing listen or something to warn people about the intersection. And if somebody pushes a button to cross, it could be done in such a way that it can stop people on the main road and then let people cross the street. So I think it'll be more successful pursuing the blinking light.
All right. Now, the other question I have, and it's come up, is the entrance and exit and input of the number of exits in the morning. We seem to be around the 150 mark. Now, I assume that 150 was done through all of the standards in your business and to come up with that number. Now, how do we, Sam, develop any other number? I mean, I know that we all question, and the chairman has said, look, I think there are going to be more people coming in and out. Well, it's not built yet. So how do we go around coming at the number that we all could feel good about, that it's going to deal with this project?
Yeah, I think the one way, and sometimes we actually encourage to do that, is to count an existing location in town. Let's say you have an apartment complex, and you know the number of units in there. So you put a tube at the driveway, and then you count, so that you know the trip generation characteristics of that particular location. And if it's in a similar area, you can say, by extension, let's say we had 200 units here, and they're generating 100 trips. So maybe if we have 100, 300 trips or 300 buildings or units, it's going to generate 150. So the only way to prove this is to count an existing location, in this, whether in Milford or in surrounding towns.
So you're saying you can rely on the professional information, but at the end of the day, you got to have some people standing there at the right times and count the cars that actually would. Well, you can't, because at that point it's not available to you.
No. I mean, the data that we use, it's all historical data that's been counted all across the nation, different places. And there's been certain times that you tend to even overestimate the number of trips, and you go back and let them count. I mean, one way to get maybe the developer to look at things is, okay, this is what you are saying now, these are your assumptions. So maybe after it is developed, you can make it a condition that go back and count the driveway. And if you are generating more trips than you said, then put X, Y, and Z, mitigation in place. So the board has that leeway to say that, look, we can agree with the numbers, but go ahead and build it and monitor the traffic for the next 4 or 5 years. And if you're higher, then, do this mitigation at this location. So you have that.
So what do you think of the methodology that Sam is talking about right now?
So the data that we presented is an industry standard, as you mentioned, and it's based on observations that, as Sam pointed out, numbers of different facilities that are like this. We typically go and we do counts at residential projects, commercial projects, retail projects, to better understand how those numbers come out. And one of the things that we've discovered is that typically ITE in Massachusetts, for some reason, is actually higher than what we actually observe in many cases. I'm not saying all cases, but in many cases. If it would make the board more comfortable for us to go pull some of the data from some of those residential projects that are out here in the Metro West, we may not have a site that's fully comparable to this one, but we can certainly go research some of that data and present it to the board and to Sam to say, listen, there's a project, Legacy Farms, for example, over in Hopkinton. They have probably more units out there than this, but you'll see the ratio of units to trips, and say, hey, look, it is about 50% of it, so that you guys can sort of rest a little bit easier on that.
So that would be like getting the closest you can to real time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
The other thing that is not unheard of is, as Sam said, doing post-occupancy monitoring counts and just saying, hey, listen, how far over did we estimate the traffic counts, or in extreme cases, how far under did we, and is there some sort of issue that we need to deal with at that point in time?
Okay. One final question, because I know I have other board members. All right. The thing that I'm somewhat trying to get squared in my mind is the impact of traffic, okay? Now, what I've seen talked about is, we all know we've got the Fortune Boulevard, we've got the Beaver Street intersection. We also have further on down the 109-16 intersection.
Yep.
So, and then you mentioned that you looked at the impact of Stop and Shop and the whole Kmart, former Kmart Plaza. You looked at the impact of the stone plant and the other things going on up there. So the question I have is, there seems to be some controversy, even with the board members, rightly so. That's our job, to try to understand this.
Sure.
How do we assure ourselves that we know that the traffic study there, that the impact isn't greater? I mean, you've said you brought in some things, but could you just kind of square away that for me?
So there is a little bit of leap of faith that's required, and I know that with traffic engineering, that's something that is probably it's not like other engineering topics that are pretty cut and dry and you can look at it. For the same reasons that you're having some concerns about the number of trips that this residential project's going to generate, those other projects used the same methodologies to arrive at how much traffic they were going to generate as well. And since we don't know truly at the end of the day how much traffic they're going to generate until they're actually operational, we have to rely on our projections. And we have to rely, frankly, on the fact that they're done to what we consider industry standards. And I think that's when you rely on your consultant to sort of say, yes, board, it was done the right way. But at the end of the day, we can slice it so many different ways and try to come up with the right answers. As long as it was done to the industry standard, that's the best I can do and tell you. If there's things that we missed, you mentioned a couple of things that were going on that we may not have included. That's stuff that we should go back and sort of factor into the analysis. But if it's done, if we factored it all in and we've done it the right way, I think there's a point where the board just sort of has to say, it was done the right way, and these are the impacts, and then base your decision on that.
And Sam, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think it comes to a point where, we have to use the data that we have, and that is really the way that it's been done over the years, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Just like my fellow board members here, I have a real concern about some form of signalization in that area. Every person on this board is a lifelong resident of this town. Myself personally, I have friends that live on Whispering Pine. I can assure you that coming out of Whispering Pine onto Route 16, you are literally taking your life in your hands. That is without any additional traffic. It really doesn't matter to me what the numbers are, but there may be posted speed limits of 40 miles an hour. I can assure you it's nowhere close to that. But whether the state is going to take a firm stand as far as signalization in this area goes, that will certainly somehow have to be debated and handled somehow through this board. That's my first comment. My second comment is, Bob, when you talk about the ITE numbers, and Sam, I may need some clarification on this also. We have daily trip numbers in the 9th edition of the ITE that come in around 1940 trips per day. 10th edition says 1635 trips a day. When you talk about AM peak hours, 150, and then the 10th edition talks about 100 trips a day, which is basically the numbers that you talked about that were up on the screen. But then I look down here, and when you talk about the Table 3 from TIAS, and it gives the number of the 970 weekday daily trips. And then the comment later is that that is a one-way number. So if I could have some clarification on that, Bob, I'd appreciate it.
Yep, no, my pleasure. So much like any updated versions of your software that you have in your phone, the IT trip generation manual is updated on a every couple of years basis. Oh, sorry. It's the IT trip generation manual is updated on a couple every year basis. It gets new data in, it looks at it, it synthesizes it, it puts it into their algorithms, their computer programs, and comes up with the new volume of trips. And in theory, it's more accurate because now we've got more data points to rely upon and the such. So what we did as part of the original traffic study that was done was we used 9th edition data. Since that time, the 10th edition of the Trip Generation Manual has come out. And what it did was it looked at apartment uses. The 9th edition that we looked at was an apartment generation, and it ranged in size, as I mentioned before, anywhere from 5 units all the way up to the thousands of units.
Right.
And it has sort of like a mathematical equation that if you have 300 units, it's going to come out at 150 trips in the morning peak hour. If you have more, it's going to come out with more, et cetera, et cetera. The 10th edition actually said, wait a second, we're starting to break down this data and we're realizing that there really isn't a big difference between an apartment traffic generation and, say, a townhouse generation where the units are all jammed packed together, where you've got a whole bunch of, sort of houses next to each other. So instead of going with apartment and then for sale kind of condo units, we're going to generate traffic as sort of just residential projects of a short single-story or two-story rate, a mid-range, which is somewhere between 3 and 9 stories in height, and then a high-rise, which obviously this project isn't, which is greater than 9 stories for apartment rentals or residential condominium uses. So the 10th edition information that you see here is actually based on the updated approach that IT is taking, and what it's actually suggesting is there's going to be less traffic than what we used in our traffic study out there. We didn't adjust the numbers, we didn't adjust our evaluation, but this is something that Sam asked us to take a look at. And what you find is that there's going to be about 100 trips according to the new estimation, because I think some of it has to do with what Sam talked about, is that people no longer are working the typical 9 to 5 shifts. They haven't been doing that for, say, 15 years now, but the data is now catching up to that, and it's starting to change some of the way traffic is generated. There's going to be 100 trips, is what it's saying, during that busy one period between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning, but there's probably going to be 95 trips between 6 and 7, and probably 90 trips between 5 and 6 that happen out there, and it's just going to be spread out over the course of the day. There's going to be less traffic during that one particular peak hour, but it's going to be spread out a little bit more during the morning and evening rush hours. Similarly, the evening peak hour is a little bit different as well. It's a little less than what we did. I think it's important for the board to understand that we use the higher numbers, the 9th edition numbers, so our project impacts out here consider that fact. The next comment that was asked, BSC actually caught a flaw in our chart, which said that there were 970 weekday PM, or 970 daily trips out there. What was reported was the one-way volume of traffic out there. So the comment and our response to that basically says, my mistake, our mistake, there's actually 970 trips coming in and 970 trips coming out, and that's the correction that you see there. So there'll actually be 1,940 trips coming to and from the site. We don't use that number for analysis and the development of mitigation or anything like that. It's just a number that sort of demonstrates how much traffic is coming to and from the project. The peak hour numbers are the ones that we spend the most time spending evaluating.
Sam, you agree with that?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, not a question, more of a comment, just to reiterate some of what's been said, because in my years in Milford, I've had a lot of experience. We've had a lot of projects where lights have been proposed, and we've dealt with the state on whether or not the warrants were met. And in every instance that we've dealt with, even trying to elicit support from our local state representatives and senators, if the warrants are not met, they will not approve it, has been the experience that we've had. If they've softened in recent years, maybe, but I doubt it. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. If I can, on the other point that you had made earlier, I think both of you guys, all three, like the board has made, the idea of a flashing light at the intersection is something that I think we can explore with MassDOT. I think there's some benefits to that, particularly given the fact that there's some concern about sightlines out here, and I think that we might be able to sort of use that to sort of buttress our argument and say, hey, listen, is there an opportunity to put something out there? It would be appropriately done, and I'd want to work with the neighborhood as well, because now all of a sudden you've got a flashing light that's out there that happens to
Well, at
flash.
1,940 trips, it changes dramatically from 970.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pass it down. We'll keep going. Why aren't any of the traffic studies done before 7 o'clock in the morning? Just a quick question.
I think what we found over time is that the peak times of the roadways, the busiest times of the roadways, are between 7 and 9 in the morning, and between 4 and 6 in the evening. So we do our specific turning movement counts during those periods of time. What we also do is we put roadway tubes out on the street to sort of see how much traffic is out there before and after those periods over the course of a day. That's how we came up with the 11,700 trips that happen on the roadway. And we look at that and say, if there's 600 trips on Route 16 at 7 to 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's, say, 800 trips between 6 and 7 in the morning, then we need to adjust our traffic times. In this particular case, the peak period, as Sam pointed out, is between 7 and 8 in the morning, and that's what we studied.
Hey, Bob. Regarding the roadway going in and out, are there, and will they help, are there speed bumps that are designed to, and will they help with the safety of exiting and entering the site?
Speed bumps within the site, there's something, if the roadway appears to be too busy, speed bumps are something that in this particular case could be considered. You're going to be coming to a stop condition at the end of the site driveway when you get to Route 16, regardless of what happens. So whether or not they should be traveling at a slow speed, I would recommend. I'm not sure how.
Will that make the entering onto 16 more, I guess, uniform, spaced evenly?
No, at the end of the day, you pull to the intersection, you stop. If there's a car behind you, it stops behind you, and then it pulls up. It's the way of traffic. What I do want to make sure is that the driveway is designed in a safe manner, and that the appropriate curves and all that sort of design parameters are in there. If they discover over time, what we've done with some projects, if we discover over time that cars are driving down that particular driveway at like 40, 45 miles an hour, that's not what they want, that's not what we want, and that in that situation we may consider putting speed bumps in.
I'm going to guess, my eyes are gone, but I'm going to guess that's over 1,000 feet of straight shot.
Just under 1,000 feet.
close.
Yeah, good estimate.
Pretty close. As far as these studies go, which I know we've been commenting a lot on, I noticed one of the studies had based on a 2010 census. Is that out of date? Is that the latest one?
They do them every 10 years. I'm not sure that they collect any more of the data for Journey to Work, unfortunately. I think they did away with that, at the last. So there's more economic data that's going to be gathered, but most people today fill out the short census version, and it happens every 10 years. And it doesn't include Journey to Work data. So if moving forward, we're actually going to have to use data that's provided to us by third parties that are not government entities, and it's going to just make our job a little bit more complicated. It's important, it's one of the reasons why we looked at the residential streets that were also feeding into Route 16 to make sure that our assumptions were reasonably on target with that as well. Again, these are residential streets, so if 20% of them are turning right and 80% are turning left, our driveway projections should be pretty close to that as well.
Okay. And I do want to make a comment. I do like the real-time study. I think that's important. I know you guys have to go by, you can't study every site out there. But I just want to read something I found on Facebook. I won't mention any names, but just to give everybody kind of an insight of live time. Met one of my daughters. This is not me. This is someone on Facebook. Met one of my daughters at Applebee's in Milford. After we were done, I took a left out of the, by the way, Applebee's is on 109. Yep. After we were done, I took a left out of the parking lot to head home to my house in Milford. She headed on 495 south to her house. I called to tell her that I just made the turn from Medway Road to East Main Street, and I wasn't even in front of Imperial Hyundai yet. I wanted to know how far she went when I hadn't even made it a half a mile. She was at exit 10. Milford's exit 19. There's no easy way to get around town after 4 p.m., and that is my report for today. It's busy. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but to be aware of the real-time aspect, I think if we did hear a couple of studies being done, that would at least appease me.
Okay, so very good.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the LOS ratings that you discussed. So my first question is just more of a clarification, I guess. Those D ratings are, those are not the current ratings, those are with the project, correct?
Correct. Let me just confirm that.
I was.
Oh, I know where it is. So table 7, which is on page 19, is the signalized intersection of evaluation of Beaver Street, Fortune Boulevard, Main Street, East Main Street, and what you look at we ran the morning and evening existing conditions, no build conditions, and the conditions with this project. All of those show level of service D or better. In fact, there's only one D-rated movement within that intersection during the peak hour, and that's the westbound left turn lane. So that would basically be Route 16 turning left, heading down towards the former Kmart Plaza down there. So that's obviously a heavy movement, busy movement during that period. The unsignalized analysis, and Sam did point out, the impacts to the roadways not named Whispering Pines all stay at level service, actually D or better in that situation. Again, turning out of Zane Circle is one of the ones we looked at. There's about 15 cars that do that during the busy peak hour of the day, and they do that with some delay, but it's level service D or better there. Whispering Pines being the one exception to that, obviously with our driveway located opposite it, they'll see some impacts there. There's not a lot of traffic that's turning out during the evening peak hour. We've counted 6 cars that did it. And they'll see a level of service that's comparable to, E or E. It's busier. It's a lot busier out there with this driveway.
Thank you.
How are we doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good. The traffic's going to be the traffic. I'm going with an assumption we're going to have a plus minus 5% of what the study is. Is that about accurate?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we're accurate. There's fluctuations all the time in everything that we do. Yeah. I wish that I could say it's an exact science, as I said earlier.
The traffic down there, no matter what we do, is not going to improve it. It's as simple as that. We all know that. Anybody from Milford knows this problem down there.
Yeah.
My question is regarding a bus stop, whether it's school, mass transit, elderly.
Yep.
My thing would be, on a safety standard, that the bus stops at the entranceway at pickup. Evidently, I'm not picking the microphone up enough. So that would be my thing, that the bus could only stop coming towards town.
Yep.
That way, and it's got to pass off where it can pass off, where the traffic keeps going by while they're picking up. That's where I would like to see a flashing light be incorporated when that bus is at that locale.
Interesting. Okay.
That's when I would like to see a flashing light. Signals may or may not work. I think that's something the future will tell. And the next question, I guess, is would Mass DOT get involved in the event there were some serious issues down there where a signal might be warranted?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the signal warrants, the justification for them at this point in time are based exclusively on volume and the fact that there may be or may not be pedestrian traffic out there, which we're not going to see the levels that meet that. If there was an issue out there, if something materialized that we didn't foresee out there, then MassDOT might get involved. And unfortunately, some of that is safety-based, and you'd have to see, it's morbid to some degree, but you'd have to see a certain amount of accidents happen out there in order for that to be justified. In those situations, then the state would step in and say, listen, we looked at it, your peer review consultant looked at it, and the state looked at it and didn't see a reason for a signal, but now we're all coming back and saying, yes, now there is a reason for a signal because it's safety-based, not not volume-based. And the only way that happens is, like I said, it's a little bit morbid, but it's based on actual collisions and crashes happening,
Yeah,
which
it's
we don't
gonna-
foresee. None of us foresee happening, but
It's going to be an
that's
after-the-fact issue.
correct.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
But again, my thing is, and it's going to be as long as I'm on this board and regarding this matter, is the safety issue regarding some sort of, the buses, all three different type transports, having an area to pull off of, the people, children, elderly, whatever, whoever's living there, having the ability to safely get on board, and when that bus is pulling away, some character coming 65 to 70 miles an hour, which they do down there.
Oh, yeah.
They do, coming around that corner, and something flashing well up front, saying, actually, I'd like to see the flashing when they're there. And some other sign down the road, traffic entering right, left, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so what we'll do to answer that question, we'll work with your school department to identify the best location for where they want to bring their buses to. Some school departments are willing to bring them into the site if there's enough of a demand. Others want to pick them up right on the street. They don't want to delay their operations. So we'll work with your school department to identify that. We'll also work with the Metro West RTA, who provides that shuttle bus service along Route 16 out there, and identify what they want to see out there. And then ultimately we'll work with MassDOT to say, hey, listen, the MWRTA wants to see this, the school department wants to see this. Can we work with them to develop a bus location that's safe and meets their challenges, their desires? Or not. They may say, we don't want a bus stop on that street. It's too busy, it's too fast. You have to bring them into the site. The DOT is weird like that in some cases. I hope there's no DOT people here. But yes, again, I opened my presentation by saying, the operational impacts of this are one thing, but the safety impacts of this are paramount to making sure that this project works. And it's something that I take seriously, I know Sam takes seriously, and I know the department and this board and the town take seriously, more so than just the added couple of seconds of delay that people might have to exhibit. It's much more important to us that we design it right and we make it work well.
We're finding out over the past probably 5, 6, 7 years, some of these PRDs in town that are being permitted to plan residential developments, we're finding out, even though some of these are limited to just 2 bedrooms, there are children in the neighborhood, and those developments are now making adjustments to provide a parking lot close to one of them close to the Route 16 mark, and also some type of drop section within there so that the buses can go in, loop, and come out and safely have the kids enter the bus. So I had mentioned that on our first meeting to take a look at that and the possibility of having a small parking area over there for people within the development. You're over 1,000 feet of road in here. By the time you get into the entire development, it's going to be a long walk for a child to get to the end of that subdivision, and some type of mechanism for the safety of those children, if there are any, is probably paramount. Have you taken a look at the Whispering Pine road width to see if there's a possibility of maybe a right turn only heading east that could probably help that situation? I know when the road was built, there's some easement room there. I don't know, but if you could look at that to see if that can maybe avoid some stacking while someone is waiting for a break in traffic, they're going to be heavily impacted on this particular project.
Mr. Chair, can I just ask a clarification? Are you looking for a separate right and left turn lane coming out of it, not an...
I don't know if you can do a separate left turn, but if there's enough room so someone's not sitting in traffic on Whispering Pine just to go right.
Okay, all right. I understand what you're saying. You're not saying...
It backs up. They're there for 3 minutes or 4 minutes just trying to wait for a break in traffic.
You're not saying
now they're going to be
strict left turns.
Right.
You're saying allow for a right turn.
At least take a
to
look
happen
and see
easier.
what can improve
We can
with
look at
that. With that, I see our town engineers here. Mike, do you have a comment you'd like to come up and talk about, please? We already mentioned the sight lines. Yeah. Working on them. Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to see if we can get some better communication concerning the consultants, the sight lines with the town engineers, so that you know, at least he's in the loop on all of this coming along. It would be helpful so we don't get in stressful situations and then it becomes unpleasant on both ends. Anybody else in the audience care to be heard? What I'd like you to do is have a seat. Come up and please provide your name and your address and ask your question. Microphone. You can pick it up, hold it. Just don't throw it. You got to hold it close. You can pull it right up.
Pick the whole thing right up? Okay. I'm not a performer. I'm Jim Flanagan. I live on 8 Whispering Pine Drive for the last 20 years. I'm really quite disappointed in what I've heard, and I'm going to try to stick to the facts and explain why. First of all, if I'm missing something, let me know, but we don't have detailed proposal of this left-hand turn lane. So we're talking about something that we can't even see. Now, I live on Whispering Pine, and I know I'm only one of the few vehicles, okay, but I'm asking this board to protect me as a resident here, because I'm one of the few people that does pull out of there, and you people aren't there yet, and you're designing everything to take care of yourselves, which is really unfair. So if I pull out of Whispering Pine every morning when I go to work and I turn left, now I have to cross 2 lanes because there's going to be another lane there, a mystery lane, an unknown lane that we haven't seen. How can we even respond to that? That's not really fair. You should have provided this, and I know you have to work with Mass DOT, but you should have come in with a proposal because this is really kind of smoke and mirrors about what we're talking about in terms of the design.
Jim, just to be fair to the board and the applicant, this is just the second meeting, so as we come out of the first meeting, we requested more information. So now we are talking about other stuff. Of course they're going to need to provide those with us. We will see those. You will see those.
Right.
But we just don't have them yet.
And I understand it won't be final because they do have to work with it, but I was here for the last meeting, and I expected at this point we would have seen a little bit more detail, but we have none. Also, we're talking about bus drop-off. At least with the notes that I've seen, the bus drop-off is on the northbound or on the Whispering Pine side. There's a bus drop-off there. So we have a bus drop-off there, a travel lane, and a left turn lane. That's quite a bit of construction, apparently. I would like to get a little bit more information about there. If I understand your numbers correctly, and we've been through this, there's about 1,000 cars during rush hour going each way. And you're adding about 120 or 150, whatever the number is. That's more than 10%. How can anybody's math say that's only 2 or 3 seconds delay? It's a 10% increase. Now, I know there was some correction to that about waiting instead of 28 seconds up to 75 seconds coming out. I challenge you to get out of Whispering Pine Drive in 28 seconds today. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. So when you use these counts, they're not based upon real data. I know that in your table 5, in your response to comments, it showed only 30 more cars in the morning. I didn't understand that table, so that would be a question for clarification. The line of sight, and there's been a lot of discussion about that with the vegetation. I'm not sure if you've addressed the line of sight already from Whispering Pine and what that traffic will do and what the change will do. But I also remind you that we had a significant snow event not too long ago. With the snowbanks there, it's very difficult to see when you pull out. And you need to look at that. It's not just the vegetation. So we have both summer and winter line of sight issues. As I understand what you had said, and these are from my notes, you said that in your analysis you actually looked and there were about 300 gaps in the traffic that would provide a car to exit. If you're adding 150 cars in that hour, doesn't that take up half of those gaps? So aren't you really effectively doubling the waiting time for anybody to pull out? If you use up half of the slots, your numbers just don't add up. There's something wrong with your math. From my perspective, based upon what I've seen, I know it's an inconvenience for you to move this site, this driveway, from the Whispering Pine here. I don't have problems with development. I do have problems with the traffic and how it impacts me personally. There are other residents there. I know you keep saying there's only a few there. There are 13 houses in there, and you're not concerned about them, but you need to be concerned about them. And they will be talking to you if this continues this way. It has been addressed about Milford Stone and how they slow down the traffic. I don't know if you have observed that when you've done the traffic studies, but it really does. Sometimes it does back up from Milford Stone all the way past Whispering Pine Drive. And also there are school buses, so in the morning sometimes you have a double impact. There was some talk about other sites like Milford Crossing, whether they had been considered or not. There was a good anecdotal story about that. I don't know what their traffic study said. One of the comments was, well, those sites need to do something about their mitigation. Well, that site already exists, and we're already dealing with that. But I can't go down that way anymore. The traffic is terrible, and that site's not even fully occupied. And anybody who's driven down there knows what I'm talking about. With respect to the state warrant for the traffic signals, I understand that there are standards of development and such. But in this case, I'm asking us to use some good judgment. One of the options is after the fact, if we have some, I think your word was morbid safety situations, I don't want my family to be that morbid situation. And I'm asking you to consider that now. So if we can't get traffic signal in there, I think we should insist on moving that driveway. I know it's inconvenient and there are other things, but your problems in developing the site should not make me sacrifice my family for that. One of the other comments that was made about the light, and I'm not really arguing for the light because I just think the driveway's in a bad spot, but there was a comment that you made about, well, someone driving along and then they might be surprised to see a light there. Well, don't you think people are going to be surprised to see a driveway and see cars pulling out now? It doesn't make any sense. That comment just didn't make any sense to me. So those are my concerns, and I'm asking the board to really consider what you're doing to the people on Whispering Pine Drive if this goes through. And I ask you to really consider forcing that driveway to be relocated. It's just a bad location. And again, I'm not against the development of the site, but I really am against what it's really doing to me and my family. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and yes, we will take that in full consideration. Anybody else care to be heard? Yes, ma'am. We did ask that tonight, ma'am. We did bring that up tonight, and we are asking them to take a look at that. I haven't got a comment yes or no yet. Do we have an answer on that? Are you going to be looking at the traffic? Because we'd like to see that be brought up to date.
In talking to the applicant, they're willing to take a look at it and see what the operational impacts of the project would be down, say, Route 16 a little further, down towards 109. We know that there are busy intersections. There's 3 of them that surround Fortune and Beaver as you get out there. So we can look at those. I can look into my crystal ball and tell you that the level of impact associated with this project at that are going to be relatively minimal. But we're willing to look at it for you if that would make the board happy.
Thank you. And I'd like to have Mike Dean, if he would, reach out to the company. And I know we talked about this relocating the entrance. And I don't know what the town engineer's thought was on that. Mike, can you comment on that? Okay. Yeah, let's get the town engineer the full layout as much as we have right now so that we can take a look at that, please. But that has been brought up and it is being looked at. Anyone else? Michael? Come on down, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mike Visconti, and my residence is about as far removed from this project as you can be in this town. However, in my experience, it seems to me that a generally accepted design principle is not to locate entrances across from each other, especially across a state highway. This creates an extremely unsafe situation for not only the folks on Whispering Pine, but also the folks who will be living in the subject proposal. I would suggest to you that anything and everything is done to offset the entrance as far as possible so that it creates a safe situation for both Whispering Pine folks entering and exiting and also the folks who live in this new apartment complex. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Come on up. You're welcome. I wish we had some music. We could probably do some dancing or something. You know, come on up.
You have addressed my comment on the traffic where you've asked for studies of these hotbed snarl intersections and the impact, the additional impact that this project would have on it. So I'll hold that until I see what the feedback is on that. And then the second thing is I didn't realize that this was limited to the traffic, so I had another issue, which is, water supply. So I'll hold that until that comes up.
Yeah, we are going to address that at the next, water and sewer will be our next focus. That'll be the next meeting.
Thank you for getting those other 3 intersections.
Okay. Yeah, and again, this is a work in progress. There will be constant changes and constant communications. We've heard and traffic is always a big thing, and clearly having the entrance where it is a concern, and I'm glad that was brought up because it does need to be looked at. I want to comment that I'd like to see the town engineer take a review at that and look at it because it makes perfect sense. And again, this is about safety. This is probably, and I don't want to say this in a negative way, but it's probably a less impactful situation than a giant office park when we would probably have 3,000 cars exiting out of there at the same time. So at that point, there would be a demand for a light, but I think maybe making an effort to take a look at moving this entrance from a safety standpoint is a good idea. Does anybody else want to be heard before we continue on and schedule the next meeting? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, Stephen Zief, Eden Management, and representing the owner on this. I wanted to say thank you to you all for your patience and your time. In my 30-something years of doing this for a living, I know traffic and parking are always two of the major issues. We will look at expanding the scope and seeing what we can see about the effect on the other intersections that are beyond the area that we did. We will also look at an alternative front entrance. I will tell you that, like yourselves, we're very concerned on trying to do the best job we can. We went to a conscious effort to resolve where we put the intersection because we thought it would serve both the folks who live in Robsham Village and also those around us. We thought it would actually provide the least amount of conflict and the most amount of efficiency for everybody concerned. We will look at an alternate location. I will tell you that personally, I believe that you will set up potentially more conflicting movements by relocating. So, but again, we are at your service and we will look at that. It's our pleasure. If that kind of closes out the transportation discussion, we would appreciate the indulgence of the board to understand what your thoughts are on a schedule going forward and identify what the topics are, because we'd like to be able to stay in pace with you and not show up with late letters or anything like that. And to do so, we'd ask you if we could come up with a tentative set of dates and times and topics, and then obviously if things change, that's the way life is, they'll change.
Yeah, and I guess I think the frustration was that the stuff that started hitting this afternoon maybe wasn't provided enough time. It was about a 4 weeks. So if you want to go out 4 more weeks or 5 more weeks, we could bring it to February 21 or 28. It's a Wednesday.
Council tells me, Mark tells us his availability is the 21st, so the 21st is good for us.
Is that give you enough time to be able to get documents to us for review prior?
Well, what you'd like, you'd mentioned that you'd like to discuss water and wastewater.
Yeah, we can finish up the traffic, and then we'll go into the water and sewer.
Yeah.
How's that?
I love the word transportation.
I know,
traffic
it's
is
beautiful.
pejorative. Traffic is pejorative. Transportation is positive.
We'll finish up the traffic, and we'll go into the water and sewer.
All right.
And the 21st?
On the 21st.
And then for scheduling purposes, maybe we can pencil in March 14th or the 21st?
I'm at your pleasure. I got to look at Mark and ask him what he thinks of his date.
I mean, it's, again,
March 21st?
off a week or
Again.
not. And again, we'll pencil that in, but then again, providing we can continue to get the documents so that everybody's got a fair opportunity to review the documents.
Right. So March 21st.
March 21st.
And what would be your pleasure for that night?
Overall site.
Well, civil engineering is Dan's forte.
How are you doing on all the engineering? The civil engineering, the ground engineering? I know you have assumptions.
Right.
So, that we'd be handling the engineering on that time frame, the site engineering.
Well, the March 21st, Dan Feeney can't be here, and that's civil engineering.
Do you want to push it back a week? 28th?
Is the 20th? Can you do the 28th, Mark? Okay.
All right, so we'll do March 28th.
All right. So March 28th will be the balance of civil engineering.
Correct.
And
And then
when you say environmental, you mean wetlands?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not talking about a 21E here. Okay. So March 28th will cover civil engineering and wetlands.
Yes, then we'll do that together.
All right.
And then we'll overflow anything additional to the following, beginning of the following meeting, which would be April, and then let's see if we can pencil in April 25th.
All right. So April 25th, we would do overflow, and maybe by that time we
Follow-ups on different aspects of certain items.
start to do what I call cleanup a little bit, maybe.
Probably a couple of cleanup sessions, Steve.
Well, listen, I have to get cleaned up every day.
There'll be a couple of cleanup sessions.
Okay.
But our deadline is what? Is June, sometime in June?
We filed November 1st.
6 months is when?
May 1.
May. Right.
Yeah. So far, so good.
So yeah, we'll focus on those dates. If we've got to push it a week, just try to give us advance notice if there's a conflict of someone's schedule,
Okay.
because we'd like to be able to notify people.
Yeah, no, all this, all the way around.
Beautiful. Okay, great.
We want to
All
be
right.
your partner in this effort.
All right, great. All right, one last business item. We have the minutes from the last meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
I make a motion we approve the minutes as written.
Motion by Charlie, second by John. All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. If you need clarification on any of the dates, feel free to call the town. We'll put everything on the website, and we'll put the, you want to put the dates up there too, public hearing dates? And we'll put the dates up there for the hearings as well. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Good evening.